Thank you, Alice. Good level for that. Yeah, good afternoon. This last lot I will try to keep to time. I'm going to talk to you about flooding, risk resilience and dealing with flooding in old buildings. I would say that I'm talking here about natural flooding. I'm not talking about flooding that may occur, say, as a result of one of our other disasters like lead being stripped from a roof and therefore rain getting in where it wouldn't otherwise have done so, or flooding that may be as a result of overzealous use of water after a fire in an historic building. I'm looking at natural flooding, and it's interesting, it sort of links in with a number of things that have already been talked about. Nigel talked about prevention rather than cure. Ben talked about potential disasters happening, and Steve also talked about the issue of climate change, and these are also all linked to the idea of flooding is very much one of those. Well, there was also the shutting the stable after the horse had bolted as well. So a bit of context, why are we talking about flooding? Obviously climate change is an issue. Well, flooding events were considered to be the sort of thing that happened once in a generation. However, UK flood events have been recorded as taking place in 2005, 2007, 2009, 2013-14, 2015-16, and in 2016 as well. And in 2009, 2005 and 2015, communities that had previously experienced flooding events experienced them again. So it is no longer a once-in-a-generation matter. The impacts of climate change and extreme weather are going to be with us and continue to get worse, and therefore we must assume that a lot of low-lying communities are going to, if they haven't been flooded already, will be, and those that have been will be again, and we need to be doing something about it. Two examples there. I work in the Yorkshire Dales and Cumbria, and those are both photographs from Storm Desmond in 2015. At the top, that is Appleby. That's the Eden having broken its white banks, which it regularly does so. And at the bottom, that is Kendal after Desmond, which was a more rarer occasion. And this was a BBC report after Desmond, which highlighted, unfortunately, the fact that insurers don't really join the dots in terms of paying for reinstatement, but not thinking about the idea that actually, if you're looking to reinstate after flooding, you should perhaps at the same time be thinking about improving the flood resistance, flood resilience of the property at the same time. And it was something that was picked up by Emma Boyd, Chair of the Environment Agency at the time, and she highlighted it, and the fact that actually from the perspective of insurers it's actually a more economic thing to do, but because of the way the system works with loss adjusters, and when you have a flood event, it is an emergency event and people want to do things as quickly as possible, that sort of thought process tends to get lost amongst various other bits and pieces, and there are other factors as well. There was this little pyramid that, whilst if you go up to the top of the pyramid, you are improving and increasing your flood resistance and flood resilience. But at the same time, it's going to cost you more to do it. It might increase the value of your property, it might improve your insurance options, but it is, in a lot of instances, down to cost. And those at the bottom, the ones who do nothing, are the ones who, we've been talking about quite high-end historic buildings today, but there are a lot of people who got involved, who suffered from flooding in the recent flooding live in they are traditionally constructed buildings, but they are much simpler buildings, some unlisted, and they are the ones who down at the bottom tend to do nothing. So how do you approach flood resistance or flood resilience with traditional buildings? There are two approaches really. There's one of flood resistance and the other is flood resilience. Flood resistance is the idea of actually stopping the water getting into the building in the first place, without it, and without it impacting on structural integrity, and if it does get in, actually having materials that enable you to clean it out quickly. So it's the water exclusion approach as a preference to the flood resilience approach, which is one that works on the basis of actually allowing water to come into the building, but also allowing it to drain away again quickly afterwards, and in combination with that, actually using materials that enable that building to dry out and be reoccupied with minimal impact as a consequence. And in terms of deciding which strategy you take, to be honest, with most old buildings, you are probably going to do something which is a combination of the two. There's going to be a degree of flood resistance work and also flood resilience work. But there are two things you need to consider before you decide what you're going to do, and they are two. One, how is the building actually constructed? What's it made of? How it's put together? And then, importantly, to understand what the flood risk is and where the water is coming from. There are post-flood Desmond up in Cumbria, there is a lot of advice from assessors being given to house owners. A friend of mine, in fact, she was flooded, and the flooding came up through her floorboards, from below, through the ground, but she was offered a flood barrier on her front door. That flood barrier is going to do nothing in terms of her flood risk. So in terms of construction, I mean, we're all very aware of this, the difference between traditional solid wall construction and cavity wall construction. Traditional solid wall construction, as we all know, works on the idea of breathability, using porous building materials. The wall absorbs the moisture and then is allowed to evaporate it out again, as a preference to your cavity wall construction, which uses more in the way of impervious building materials. It's more a waterproof type approach, actually trying to stop water getting into the building in the first place. And we're all aware that as two systems they're fine, but the trouble comes when you actually mix the two together and you try and put that waterproofing on a form of construction which is actually designed to absorb and then evaporate out again. So you're basically, by putting a waterproofing membrane on the outside of it, you're actually stopping that building from actually drying out. And obviously, in flooding instances, that the problems that we are all aware of in terms of entrapment of dampness and potential increased issues of timber decay and stone or brick erosions. Brick erosion tends to get exacerbated when you've got solid walls which have been soaked and are having to deal with large amounts of water associated with flooding. So that's construction, but then there is also the idea of thinking about where the water is actually coming from. As I said just now, there's a number of options, as that image there shows. Is it coming from below? Is it coming from the river? Is it just coming from runoff, etc.? So some examples of that, it might be as a result of the river itself having burst its banks and actually it coming in the front door of the house, and that there's potential with that for contaminated water coming in as part and parcel of that. Just for context, again, that top right-hand image is Kendal, as is the bottom right-hand image, that is the River Kent, just in the throes of actually bursting its banks. And on the left-hand side, that is Glenridding Post Office on the side of Ullswater, which wasn't flooded by the lake, but was flooded by a river that burst its banks and came down through the shop, and there was a huge amount of, it happened to them twice as well within 2 or 3 months. But you also might get, those are fairly catastrophic, but we're probably going to get more of this going forward, which is, particularly if you're in upland areas or areas where perhaps floodplains have been built on, or areas of where in periods of heavy rain the water might have soaked into the ground and now we've actually built on them and put hard surfaces down. What happens to all that water when it rains? It runs off and comes down, and you get situations like this where it comes down steep drives and you're getting water runoff into the land around the property and potentially getting into the building and issues associated with sort of overflowing drains. The flooding that you're looking at there, that was purely the result of the field across the road having been soaked to the point at which you could take no more water, and that was the direct route down was through the drive of that particular property. and in through the air bricks and into the ground floor. You might, though, have it just coming up as a result of rising water table levels, just rising up in the basement, rising groundwater, and that again has the issue of contamination, because if it also comes up through waste and through, as the picture shows there, through toilets. Again, I have a friend in Kendal who they have a basement, and they were fairly near to the river, and they looked down. We went into their basement, and they were fine. It was fine, and then they went back down again in about half an hour, and that's not their basement, but that's what they found. They found their white goods and the like floating around in their basement. Or it might just come from the idea of just actually bad maintenance. In fact, in period you've not kept up your maintenance, you've not dealt with your, as we've mentioned before, you're not very sexy, but things like cleaning gutters, making sure all those sorts of things work, they will come back to bite you when we get more extreme weather conditions that we are going to get. So what's out there in terms of options for dealing with flood resistance and flood resilience? I'll start with flood resistance. That's quite an extreme example there. There is the sort of public realm type of works. That image at the top is in Worcester, I can't remember exactly where, that sort of bund protecting the pub. That's actually from a Historic England publication. It's up the plough at Upton. Then you've obviously got sandbags, and then you've got sort of flood barriers alongside the edges of rivers. That one is, on the bottom right is Bewdley, but there's a similar one in Cockermouth and in Keswick as well. So those are sort of public realm ones. I've talked already about maintenance, actually making sure they work and that the drains work, but the drains are big, being aware that actually not only the gutters and the downpipes, but when it goes into the drains, that the drains are actually functioning and are not broken and are able to cope with increased water runoff. So if the river has broken its banks and that's how your water is coming in, how can you deal with that? Well, there are flood doors available out there now, PVC ones, and apparently there are timber ones out there now as well, but obviously from the point of view of heritage, actually replacing historic doorways with new modern PVC flood doors is perhaps not aesthetically a particularly good thing. And the issue with things like this is that you don't actually know whether they're going to work and actually do what they want to do until such time as the flood occurrence actually happens. And so they are the sort of thing that they need, again, another maintenance issue. They are the sort of thing that if you're going to install them needs to be maintained and checked on a regular basis. There are flood doors, but there are also flood gates, which I've already shown you a picture of. They are perhaps slightly less intrusive as an approach. I know of a number of situations where they have worked quite well. You've got those sort of, you notice them, but perhaps they're not that intrusive. Those sort of jams, those sort of posts either side of the door jam into which you slot your flood gate, depending upon the height of the water ingress into the building, but again, they are something that needs to be properly maintained for them to be able to maintain their seal properly. On the right-hand side, again, these are extracted from the Historic England guidance note. There are examples of flood gates actually on the entrance into the actual property boundary itself. That's great if it's a river flooding and it's coming in your front gate, but if you've got a rising groundwater level and it's coming up through your garden and up into your suspended timber floor, that as a function, that as a form of flood resistance is actually not going to be working. So again, emphasising the point of understanding your flood risk and understanding where your flood water is likely to be coming from. I showed you that picture earlier of the water runoff coming down a footpath to the front of the house and getting in the air bricks, and obviously air bricks are great from the perspective of venting the void below suspended timber floors, but obviously they're a fantastic way of water getting into that space in there and potentially rising up and flooding your building internally. There are options on the market for actually dealing or controlling the water ingress through those air bricks. There is this smart air brick, which I think is no longer available. But the idea of it is that it closes itself off when you get to the point where there's potential for water coming in. But again, there is a maintenance issue associated with that, and you don't know whether it's going to work until the actual occurrence actually happens. So is that actually a sensible way of dealing with it? There are more sort of put your wellies on and go outside and put these on as it's raining type, really? Gosh, okay, approach. Covers of varying sorts, none of which are particularly attractive. I think that one on the bottom right, which is a self-adhesive thing that you cover over your air brake with, I think, I won't say any more than that, I think. There are also whole property protection systems like this one, which is sort of trying to protect all the way around. It's possibly a little excessive, but you also need to think there is a danger with these sorts of things, that actually if a water level gets to a certain point, that it potentially might breach the top of that particular perimeter floodgate, and all of a sudden you created a swimming pool immediately around your house. So that is a consideration to be made. Other options are, I've showed a picture of the water coming up through the loo. Ways to get around that are non-return backflow, non-return valves in your manholes to actually stop the water coming up through that way. And there is the equivalent for sort of external waste. You can have non-return valves on those as well. Another good option are pumps, and so sump pumps. So these are pumps that are set into the ground, and actually when the water gets to a certain level, it takes that water and starts pumping it out. There will come a point at which, with the flood levels, it will no longer be able to cope. But it will at least, the benefit of these, it will at least give the occupier of the property time to actually go out and actually do what they need to do to move themselves and their goods and chattels either upstairs or away or whatever it may be. Just giving them a little bit more time to deal with that. In terms of options for flood resilience, we're now into the areas of actually understanding the materials with which the building is built again. The ability of the building and the materials, the ability of those materials to withstand the wetting and drying cycle, and their ability to dry out and how they are affected by water in that respect. And therefore, in terms of, and conveniently, a lot of the materials that we use in our old buildings are suitable. They are materials that can absorb moisture and can dry out without necessarily the need to strip them out. Conscious of time, so I will move on. So by way of example, here is a list of building materials. Concrete is very resistant to, it doesn't really absorb any more moisture, it's very resistant to water damage, but it's not in any way breathable, so if water gets trapped behind it, it's going to stay behind it. Stone and brick, resistant in the short term to water damage, and they are generally porous and breathable. Obviously in the longer term there is potential damage associated with it. And so on, you go down through the list, and obviously down at the bottom, the familiar material to us all, one of lime plaster that is able to resist water damage. It is porous and breathable, and crucially can be retained in large areas unless it gets particularly badly contaminated. It maintains its sort of integrity, kind of like the one above, the plasterboard, which, whilst that is porous, that fails in terms of its integrity when it gets wet and absorbs moisture. Which is why I find this slide slightly disappointing. This is from the Environment Agency and Communities Guidance on Flood Resilience for New Buildings and various materials, and I won't go through them all, but I will just point out at the bottom its reference to lime plaster in terms of resilient characteristics. It says it's poor, in terms of water penetration. Well, yes, it's a porous building material. It absorbs moisture and then dries out. That's the point of it. Its dryability, it's down as not being assessed, and its retention pre-flood to its retention of pre-flood dimensions integrity is poor. I would disagree with that. I think it is not poor, it is very good at retaining its integrity, so it's slightly concerning that that sort of thing is actually out there. In terms of the idea of breathability, most of the evaporation moisture happens through the joint rather than actually through the masonry block, but when a wall gets wet through flooding, you are going to be getting an increased amount of evaporation through the face of the wall itself. So be wary of things like this. There are a number of products out there at the moment that claim to be breathable whilst being water resistant at the same time. They may be breathable to a point, however they will reduce the ability of the material to evaporate the moisture out. And if you're actually, what you're looking to do is to dry the building out as quickly as possible, you need the walls to be as breathable as possible. And what these don't take into account is that most of our old buildings do not have damp-proof courses, so you're going to be getting a lot of moisture coming up into those walls from below rather than just a result of through the wall. Membranes and tankings, they potentially have their place, but be wary of the sort that you use. Think of, if you're going to be using membranes and tankings, they should be a system whereby they are not holding the water back in terms of retaining it behind, they are just redirecting that water away. So they're not looking to stop to actually stop it there, they're just redirecting it away from where you are. So they can be used like in this situation where there's a sort of membrane system on the floor and on the walls, and that's in conjunction with a sump pump as well. Just this is a semi-basement situation. They're actually, as you can see, that image on the left is showing the water being pumped out from that higher level point in periods of flood. Other important things, really important things, is to make sure that electrics and heating and other services are above flood level. So they are above the flood level. So your boiler is at first floor, or at least above the flood level, and your electrics and all of that are coming down from above rather than from below. So that's good from the point of view of drying the building out, because it means that you can get the power back on and you can get your heating back on and all of that sort of thing as quickly as possible. In terms of what to do, in terms of managing it, make sure you've got a plan. Think about what you're going to do rather than it happening and going, oh, what am I going to do? Actually think about it, be realistic about it, activate, do it, think about what you're going to do with your furniture or electrical goods, and it's worth talking to the insurers about the fact that you have a plan. It potentially might make a difference in terms of your particular approach. This example here, this is in Staveley, just north of Kendal. They have a sump pump in their front hallway, which as you can see, working and discharging the water to the outside. Their walls are lime plastered. Whilst they get a bit of water in, they've been flooded twice now, and they've only had to leave the house for a couple of days because of the system that they have set up and the materials that they've used on the building. They've been able to go back in, and okay, it's not fully dry, but they have been able to continue to live in it. I'm conscious of time, so I shall whiz past this, but just some main points here. What to do in terms of clearing out the damage. Act swiftly rather than hastily. Don't be pressured by your insurers or by other people to strip everything out. If you've got appropriate materials in there, the lime plastered walls that are potentially going to dry out over time, don't remove them indiscriminately on the basis it's actually that's what you've been told to do. Make sure you have a good level, good photographs as well. And in terms of drying out, dry slowly to start with using natural ventilation. If you've got heating, get the heating back on again. And a little bit further on, you can use things like high capacity dehumidifiers. That's what you're seeing in the right hand image there, and those fans. Also obviously open doors, windows, and if you've got suspended timber floors, lift a couple of the boards around the edge to give the floorboards room to because they will expand as a result of being wet, so give them room to expand without them buckling, so you don't actually have to lose the entire floor. And in terms of drying, it's going to take quite a long time to dry out, but that doesn't mean to say you can't go back in and live in it if you've got appropriate materials. If you're prepared to accept walls that are lined plastered with an appropriate breathable finish, and you're going to be getting a bit of efflorescence on those walls for a while you're actually moving back in. It's not stopping you living in it, and actually it's enabling you to go back in again fairly quickly. Also, find that to be aware of dampness management and machines that go bleep. Damp meters are calibrated for timber generally and not for masonry, and if you stick them in a masonry wall which has high levels of soluble salts within it, then you're going to get a reading which is going to be higher than you would. It's an inaccurate and misleading reading. Moisture meters can be useful to give you a pattern of moisture across a wall, but do be wary of the reading you actually get. Not talking about that now. That's cavity walls and insulation in cavity walls getting wet. Other options in terms of checking whether walls are dry: boroscopes, CCTV, and also thermal imaging can be very useful as well, in that obviously a wetter area of wall is going to be colder than a drier area of wall, so you get an idea of if you've got water being held in various voids. And finally, just to say, there is the Historic England guidance which is out there on the tables. RICS also have one, and there are various other ones out there that are useful, and there's that as well, but you'll have to look at that when you get the slides at some other point. So, thank you.